This section of the Catechism for this past week really felt like reading this gigantic love letter from God to us. Hello and welcome back to the More Than Ordinary Catechism Read-Through. My name is Abigail Gripsover and I am here walking you through the Catechism's teachings, helping to make the faith more accessible and hoping to inspire a deepening of your faith and a great awakening of love for Christ and His Church and His great design for us here. Today we are going through Christ's death on the cross, His burial, His descent into hell, His resurrection, and ascension. We are still continuing through the creeds. So we are just going to dive in because these are big topics. First of all, we start with Jesus Christ suffering under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, and was buried. These very familiar words from the Creed. The paschal mystery of Christ's cross and resurrection stands at the center of the good news that the apostles and the church following them are to proclaim to the world. This is how the Catechism begins talking about this grand topic. That's Catechism 571, the reference there. The paschal mystery of Christ's cross and resurrection is at the center of the good news that we are here proclaiming. The Catechism says later on that without the resurrection, everything we've been teaching here doesn't matter. It loses its significance without the resurrection. The resurrection is the crowning climax that makes everything true. But that begins, the resurrection begins with Christ's suffering and with His death, which is where we start. And then we go from there to build this beautiful love letter of God, everything He did for us and everything He accomplished for us and how He is so good. And He is so trustworthy because He fulfilled everything that He promised from the very beginning. He fulfilled all of His promises for us, and it was all always for us. The Catechism says that they use the Gospels combined with historical tradition to fully tell this story of Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection. And this is part of where the Church gets its true depth and richness from, is that it's always pulling from so many sources. It's incorporating all of these different perspectives, every resource that's available for us to further understand Christ, the time period, the whole circumstance of the Gospel, the whole circumstance of anything written and revealed to us by God. The Church pulls from everything to create this huge and beautiful picture, which is so important because, again, as the Catechism says at the very beginning, this is the true faith. So there isn't anything that we need to be afraid of. There is no resource that we should be afraid to dip into when it comes to looking for more original sources to help us better understand the context of God's salvation plan for us. We can lean on all of these historical and scientific resources. There is no research that's going to come out that's going to shake the faith or mean something that we're teaching here isn't true, because this is the truth. So all of these resources are available to us to build this big and beautiful picture. So the Catechism states at the very beginning that in talking about all of this, they will be pulling from all these different resources to really present this truth in the fullest way possible. So we first start with Jesus and Israel. The Catechism talks about how even throughout Jesus' public ministry, He had people opposing Him and against Him. And this is important to remember, just because you're doing the right thing doesn't even always mean the good guys are going to understand. Even the good guys won't always think that you're good. And this has honestly been the mark of a Christian and was the mark of the Jews before. People who even agreed with basic concepts and would have been surprised to find that these people they were persecuting were actually exactly what they were looking for or in agreement with them were persecuted. So, you can apply this to your own life in thinking when people who also seem to be holy and devout in the faith, or even just are really good people, and there's an area of life where you really admire their virtue, and they're critical of you and your virtue and your goodness. It's important to, first of all, to look within and be honest with yourself and ask yourself, is there something to what they're saying? Are they making an accusation or an observation that I should consider? Is there something within me in this area that I do need to work on and I wasn't aware of it before? But after you've really examined yourself and taken it to prayer, if you honestly find that you're really trying to do everything the right way. And the accusations made against you, or the ways that people don't understand you, if you really, you've looked at all the resources and you really still cannot understand where the fault is, and you've gone to spiritual direction, you've really thought about this, it might just be that you're on the right track and people don't understand what God is doing with you at this time. And so they don't understand. And so they are going to judge. There's many different ways to get to heaven through Christ. There were many different types of saints. So just remember that Jesus was persecuted. The apostles were all killed except one. And Mary herself suffered greatly. So the life of a Christian is not the life of all other Christians even understanding you or accepting you. It can be one of great suffering and persecution, even internally, even from within the church. But that's part of why what we're talking about here is so important, because if more Catholics understood the full vision of what the church teaches and what God did, we would have less division between ourselves, and we could be a stronger community for each other, prepared to stand up to those lions together, even if it means we get eaten by those lions in defense of the faith. We need that community to help stand together, but we can't be a strong community if we don't understand where each other is coming from, because we're not paying attention to what the church actually teaches, or we're accepting watered down versions of church teaching and accepting that as the full truth. We have to go back to the original sources. So, the Catechism lays out that just because Jesus was not understood by the Pharisees does not mean that he was wrong. The Catechism goes on to reference the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is addressing the law. He says that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, and then goes on to say that those who not only do, but teach others to do things against the law will suffer the consequences, whereas those who not only follow the law, but teach others to do the same will be rewarded. This do and teach, this is a reminder that we are all baptized as missionaries. From the moment that we are baptized, we are called to be missionaries and evangelists for Christ, whether that mission is right in our little homes with our little family, whether that mission is within a convent or for a specific cause, or that mission is actually traveling to other parts of the world to bring Christ. We are all missionaries from the moment of our baptism, and Christ calls us to do and teach, and also talks about the grave responsibility that we have and the consequences that there are for doing and teaching the wrong things, which again is why our church leaders and those representing Catholicism have to make sure that they know what they're teaching before they present it as being the truth, because God has very clear words about this in the Sermon on the Mount. The Catechism says that Jesus issued a solemn warning in regards to this, and this is something we must remember. In Jesus, the law no longer appears engraved on tables of stone, but upon the heart, the Catechism says in 580. Jesus' fulfillment of this law brings it to life. He takes something that was set on stone tablets and that maybe felt more rigid, more like stone, and do this or don't do that. The God of the Old Testament, we see very explosive and very terrifying things happening that can be very hard to understand sometimes in regards to how God of the Old Testament handled the deeds and the misdeeds of the Jews. Christ comes and he now embodies the new law, and now it's in the heart, and it is love shown in a way that it was there before, but there's this new part of the song that was almost like it was on the background, and now it's being brought forth to be the new focus within the new covenant, and for more people to feel even more welcome within God and his new church. The Catechism then talks about Jesus' relationship with the temple. It talks about how Christ's It talks about Christ's public ministry being patterned by his pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the great Jewish feasts throughout his whole life. And this I thought was a kind of a beautiful, just little reference to the fact that even Jesus lived liturgically. I think as Catholics, we can kind of look at the liturgical calendar that we live with now. And I guess for me, it was easy to kind of forget that the Jews and this way of liturgical living it's very natural to humanity, and it's something the Jews would have done too. They had many feasts that were very important that they observed, just like we observe our seasons within this new calendar, if you will, within the new church. So perhaps that's a silly point. Perhaps you all have thought about that a lot more than I have. But when I thought about this concept of Jesus, his life being fashioned around this pattern of traveling into Jerusalem to the temple for the great Jewish feasts, it really struck me as a reminder of Catholics traveling en masse to go to church, especially you see the churches packed at certain times of year. It just reminded me that this way of liturgical living is something that has always been important for humanity, and it's something that's very natural to us, and you see the kind of way that nature patterns us to live within different seasons in different ways. And so it only makes sense that our form of practicing our religion would follow this pattern. And throughout this whole conversation, what the Catechism is doing is it does this kind of thing where it builds up. And in the last section, it left us at Jerusalem. Christ has just ridden in on the donkey. He is the Messiah. We know that in a very short amount of time, those same people are going to turn around and crucify him. And the Catechism stops there. And then what it's doing right now is it's pausing to go through this kind of comparison of Jesus and Israel, this covenant that Jesus came to fulfill. It's taking this time to go through these things that seem like they're not relevant. It seems like isn't this kind of going backwards? Like we were kind of on a train of thought, and now you're stopping to talk about this. Why? The reason the Catechism is stopping to talk about these different things related to the Jews and Israel and the Old Covenant is because Christ's death on the cross there was so much tension around Holy Week. The Jews themselves, the people who were waiting for Christ is the one they've been waiting for. And so many of them don't recognize him and they kill him. And so the Catechism is taking time to explain how radical Jesus was and how amazing what he accomplished was, and to remind us of some of the ways and explain some of the ways that the Old Covenant worked and how Jesus fulfills those things, but wasn't coming to just kind of break everything apart and cause chaos. That wasn't his purpose. It was just that the accomplishment of this was so grand, it was hard to wrap your mind around instantly. It's easy for us. Even though Jesus is not walking in front of us, it's actually easier for us to accept it because it's been handed down to us now for over 2,000 years. We're not having to accept something new. And yes, there were so many prophecies. The Jews should have been ready, but how hard can it be sometimes to accept even good news when you've been waiting for it for so long? The phrase "too good to be true" was one that resonates with so many of us because it's a very real feeling and experience of humanity that this thing you've been waiting for is finally here. How is that even possible? This is the greatest thing. And it felt too good to be true. And it didn't look the way that they expected. And so the Catechism just wants to take time to kind of help you kind of put your mind back with Israel to remember where their minds were before all of this occurred, so you can better understand why they were so misguided and incorrect in their initial reaction to some of this, and cut them a little slack, but then also understand how incredible Christ's coming was because it fulfilled all of these things historically as well. So we talk about Jesus' relationship to the law, his relationship to Israel. We talk about how he's not always going to be accepted as the good guy, but that doesn't mean he's a bad guy. It just means, like we just said, that it's a lot to wrap your mind around. We've now talked about how Jesus comes to fulfill the law, but then renews it. He renews this law and the way that it's going to be practiced because he's fulfilling it, not because he's abolishing it and causing chaos. We then talked about Jesus in the temple, how his life revolved around that, and he had the greatest respect for it. And then he also embodied the temple himself, and he would become the new temple where we were to worship. We then talk about Jesus and Israel's faith in the one God and Savior as this section of the Catechism we're going into now. Jesus gave scandal above all when he identified his merciful conduct towards sinners with God's own attitude toward them, the Catechism says in 589. Christ comes. He's offending the Pharisees left and right by what he's saying because it is freaking them out and it doesn't seem tidy. And I just can't, so many times in reading this, I thought about different lines from C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, and the one, he is not a tame lion, always comes back to mind when I'm reading in the Catechism about Jesus. And because he's not a tame lion, but he is good. I mean, that is maybe one of the most perfect lines to perfectly capture. C.S. Lewis has a couple amazing lines that perfectly capture Christ and how amazing but also insane he and everything he embodied and came to fulfill was. And so he comes and he sits with sinners, and some of the Jews had acquired this very lofty air of like, we're the chosen ones and you're out there doing the wrong thing, and so you're too dirty to come and be with us. We are not going to lower ourselves to you because we're too holy for that. Jesus comes and has this radical love for everyone and accepts everyone into this faith. He does this to show that he's here to save everyone and to redefine the way that those who continue to carry on his faith viewed other people. This new Christian faith was going to be even broader. It was reaching out to everyone in a way that the God of the Old Testament wanted to. But the way that salvation was revealed involved more structures and more rigidity, and this new Christianity enabled by Christ's coming was a wider gate to bring more people in, to give more people the opportunity to walk through that wide gate and onto the narrow way. The Catechism concludes this kind of look at Israel by explaining that this was a big reason why Christ worked so many miracles, because what he was doing and what he came to fulfill and how he came to do it was hard to understand. So Christ performed these miracles to show his greatness, to show his divinity, to show that he was the real deal. This was it. And you could trust him and you could believe in him because he was good and he had the power appropriate for the return of God, for God's coming that they had waited for so long. The Catechism has this really fantastic line here, and in 591 it says, "But such an act of faith must go through a mysterious death of self for a new birth from above under the influence of divine grace. Such a demand for conversion in the face of so surprising a fulfillment of the promises allows one to understand the Sanhedrin's tragic misunderstanding of Jesus." God is radical. Jesus is radical. And to understand and accept this in the moment, especially in some ways you might almost say that those, like the Pharisees, like the Sanhedrin, who knew more about the prophecies, on one hand, they had even more of a reason to recognize Jesus, but on the other hand, they had spent so much more time directly studying and delving into what this Savior would be. They had probably also had more time to accidentally form their own vision of what this would look like, and for waiting for so long for the return of God gave them time to hope that he would do much grander things that would directly impact their human lives in a more practical way, if you will. And it talks in the gospel about how they wanted to make him king. They wanted him to come and to demolish the people essentially that were not agreeing with them, and to be this political leader. And that's not what Christ came to do, and that's not what he came to be. And he changed a lot of things that were simply rules that were no longer needed, but that it was hard to let go of because for so long their life had been connected to those rules. The Catechism goes from that into the section where they start talking about the trial of Jesus, and they kind of wrap up this explanation of Israel with three big paragraphs talking about how we can't blame the Jews for the death of Christ. We cannot generalize and throw this blanket statement and claim that it was the Jews that killed Christ the Pharisees were all evil and snobs, and it's because of them that this all happened, and Judas and the Sanhedrin and Pilate, they most definitely went straight to hell. The Catechism says, you can't say any of that. The Bible tells us that a lot of the Jews and Pharisees did believe in them. They were just maybe afraid to step up and afraid to say so and afraid to come out in a way that could have made a difference and prevented Christ's death. The religious authorities at the time of Christ's crucifixion were not unanimous. They didn't all agree that he should be crucified. And finally, the Catechism reminds us that the personal sin of anybody that was involved in the crucifixion and death of Christ is only known to God. Only God knows everything that was going on within them that influenced their decision and how culpable they were for their decision. So, the Catechism basically wants us to understand this. We can't blame anyone. In fact, the Catechism goes from saying that to saying, in fact, while you're wagging your little finger at the Jews, you might as well turn it around and wag it at yourself, because all sinners were authors of Christ's passion. The Catechism has this just gut-wrenching line in 598 where it says, taking into account the fact that our sins affect Christ himself, the Church does not hesitate to impute to Christians the gravest responsibility for the torments inflicted upon Jesus, a responsibility with which they have all too often burdened the Jews alone. You heard it here. Again, you're looking for the most accepting and non-discriminatory, and if anything, the most okay, you think they did the wrong thing? Well, you're not looking so good yourself right now. The Catechism, the Catholic Church, walks this amazing line of being more loving and accepting than any institution, any religion, but also being very quick to welcome you in, but then serve you a piece of humble pie once you're in the door to remind you that you are so loved by God, but don't you get a big head about it, because you don't deserve it any more than any of the rest of these people in here, but he loves you anyway. It's a paradox. It's hard to have them right next to each other, but the Catechism really takes a lot of time to lay this out here and to make sure that it's understood that we all did St. Francis, who in modern society has watered way down into being this, peace, love, hippie, animal-loving saint. He packs a punch. He is not the flimsy saint that modern society has made him out to be. And it includes this line from him that is just, again, it is like the 1-2 punch the Catechism is packing here to really put us all in our place before we then read about how amazing it is that God came and died for us. The Catechism has this quote from St. Francis of Assisi. It says, "Nor did demons crucify him. It is you who crucified him, and continue to crucify him when you delight in your vices and sins." St. Francis of Assisi, friends, we did it, and we continue to do it every day that we choose sin over him. So stop blaming the Jews and shape up. Finally, after making us feel super guilty, we go into reading about how Jesus saved us.